As everyone has heard by now, the former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has just been assassinated. To understand who Shinzo Abe was and his politics, we really have to go back to the history of Japan, especially post-World War II, to understand what he represented. Shinzo Abe was a Japanese ultra-nationalist, far-right politician who whitewashed the atrocities of imperialist Japan in the Second World War, especially against Koreans and Chinese, the horrendous Japanese atrocities against the people of China and Korea. He also is responsible for pushing changes to the Japanese curriculum and textbooks to indoctrinate Japanese children to believing that Japan was somehow a good guy in World War II instead of the imperialist aggressor that it was. He was a staunch puppet of the United States. The United States, we have to remember, has been occupying Japan since the end of the Second World War. And to understand Japanese politics, we really have to understand that similar to Western Germany post-World War II, Japan, the United States, took the Japanese war criminals responsible for some of the most horrendous crimes and put them in positions of power in Japan, top positions in the government, top positions in big business, and they were allowed to continue for the most part without any difficulty and faced no justice for their crimes against the countless peoples of Asia that they committed horrendous crimes against, even against Allied prisoners of war and Allied military, including U.S. Military personnel. It's pretty ironic. Now, to understand Japanese politics, you have to understand the ultra-right, ultra-nationalists, the people who glorify and whitewash Japan in the Second World War. These people, you might think that maybe they would be anti-U.S. because obviously the U.S. and Japan were enemies in the Second World War, and the U.S. is occupying Japan because of that, because of the victory over Japan in the Second World War. But actually, no, they're the most pro-U.S. imperialist people in Japan. In Japan, the more ultra-nationalist you are, basically, the more pro-U.S. imperialist you are. And anytime any Japanese politician, left-wing politician in Japan, patriotic politician tries to push for getting rid of the U.S. occupation of the country, these far-right ultra-nationalists with the Japanese imperialist flag and other symbolism of fascist Japan of the Second World War come out to oppose these people. So the far-right ultra-nationalists in Japan, they're the most subservient puppets of U.S. imperialism. And very similar to the establishment of the South Korean puppet regime after the end of the Second World War. In South Korea, the United States took all of the collaborators, Koreans who collaborated with the Japanese against their fellow Koreans, and put them in positions of power, most notably Park Chung-hee, one of the dictators of South Korea. He was a complete puppet of the Japanese, traitor against his own people, even changed his name to a Japanese name, complete puppet. That's what the U.S. did in Japan as well, because the United States, it just shows the opportunism of U.S. imperialism. These people that were just killing Americans a few years prior, the United States is now using them because the United States government is its primary concern is opposing the growth of socialism in the world. And in Japan, there was a strong labor movement and left-wing socialist communist movement in the country that the United States did its best to try and prevent from coming to power. The CIA intervened in Japanese elections throughout the Cold War to prop up what was Shinzo Abe's party, the Liberal Democratic Party, which is a far-right, ultra-nationalist party in Japan. The CIA propped them up in elections against the Japanese socialists and communists. And regarding Shinzo Abe personally, his grandfather was a war criminal responsible for horrendous atrocities in Japanese-occupied Manchuria during the Second World War and in the 1930s. He's well known. The Koreans, the Chinese know full well about Shinzo Abe and his history. But in the United States, it's not too well known. He's just thought of as some respectable politician. But actually, no, he has this history. And it's not just that he has this history, the sins of your parents, your grandparents, you're not responsible for. But he upholds this figure and defends him and whitewashes him. And this is This is who Shinzo Abe is. He glorifies the Japanese imperialism in the Second World War. One of his most ridiculous things that he did, most open shows of this, displays of this, was once you could see a picture of him in a Japanese fighter plane giving the thumbs up, where you could see the number on the Japanese plane says 731. He's giving a thumbs up and he's on a plane that says 731, number 731 on it. What's 731? Well, that's obviously a dog whistle. That's obviously, that's a reference to, for people who know. Obviously, if you don't know, you don't know what that is. You just think it's a random number. But there's that number specifically, Unit 731 in Manchuria, which was a place where in Japanese occupied Manchuria in the 30s and the early 40s, the Japanese conducted horrendous atrocities against Chinese civilians, Korean civilians, and other people there on a mass scale. Horrendous atrocities. If you want to look into some of these, just search Unit 731. Experimentation, amputation, live, cutting open humans when they're alive, infecting humans with diseases, freezing people while they're alive, their body parts, and then thawing them to try and test the effects on frostbite. And even worse, way unimaginable, Nazi level atrocities. This was Unit 731, and Shinzo Abe is there in a photograph on a plane giving a thumbs up with a number 731 on it, an obvious reference to that, and a dog whistle to his ultra-nationalist supporters. And of course, the Japanese propagandists today try to whitewash that, and some try and deny it, and some try and whitewash it. Some will say, oh, it never existed. Others will say, well, it existed, but it wasn't so bad. But there have actually been many Japanese veterans who were World War II veterans who were present at Unit 731, and they've come forward and told the truth about the situation. Very honest and noble, brave Japanese veterans who are willing to tell the truth about the atrocities they committed. And many of them have gone to China to spread the truth and met with Chinese and to try and mend that horrendous history of what imperialist Japan committed. And Shinzo Abe, he represents all of that evil of imperialist Japan during the Second World War, the horrendous atrocities, unimaginable atrocities committed against the peoples of East Asia. And he had dreams of recolonizing East Asia. He had dreams of recolonizing Korea, recolonizing China, but that'll never be the case. These countries, China and Korea, they're very strong powers. Japan has no ability to do that anymore. And that's actually why, going back to the U.S. imperialism aspect, why these Japanese imperialists, even though they glorify the soldiers that killed Americans in the Second World War, now they're the biggest puppets of the U.S. because they know that the only strength they have to try and attack others in East Asia is riding on the coattails of U.S. imperialism. That's the only ability they have to try and attack China or Korea, because on their own they don't. And this doesn't represent the Japanese people. The Japanese people themselves are peaceful people who want good relations with their neighbors. All of this imperialism from the Japanese ruling class, capitalist class, from the First World War and earlier, all of the expansions of Japanese imperialism prior to that, this did not represent the Japanese people. This represented the ruling class of Japan that were really propped up by U.S. and British imperialism at the time when Japan was being forcefully opened up to the West. So these Japanese ultra-nationalists, fascists, they don't represent the Japanese people. And the other anti-imperialist forces in East Asia recognize that the Japanese people are allies. They are not enemies of the Korean people or Chinese people. Kim Il-sung has talked about this. Mao Zedong and others have talked about how the Japanese people are not represented by Japanese imperialism, and that Japan should become independent once again of the U.S. occupation. Why is the U.S. still occupying Japan till this day? The Second World War ended in 1945. Why is there still U.S. troops in Japan? There's no justification for that. That needs to come to an end. And something that, Americans should understand, if you're a patriotic American, you should remember history. It was China that was allied with the United States in the Second World War. It was China who was America's ally. It was Japan that was America's enemy in the Second World War. And Shinzo Abe and these types of ultra-nationalists, far-right politicians, they represent the continuation of the Japanese imperialists who attacked the United States, who attacked Korea, who attacked China, and all these other places around the world. So if you're an American patriot, you should not have any sympathy for these Japanese imperialists. You should realize that it's China that you should ally with against these fascist forces, just like when it comes to Russia. Remember, it was the Soviet Union that was America's ally against the Nazis. And in the post-Second World War, the United States propped up all of these Nazi politicians in West Germany and put them in high positions in NATO. Just shows that the United States government does not have any loyalty to this country. In fact, all they have loyalty is to preserving the U.S. empire and the profits of the 1%. And interestingly, if we look at this assassination, this is actually not the first assassination of a Japanese imperialist politician. Famously, in 1909, Korean patriot An Jung-geun assassinated Japanese Prime Minister Ito Hirobumi in a famous, that's very well known, and An Jung-geun is recognized in Korea as a hero, patriotic hero who fought against this horrendous Japanese criminal imperialist who was occupying and exploiting Korea. And then another famous assassination was in 1932 when the Korean patriot Yoon Bong-gil assassinated the Japanese general Yoshinori Shirakawa and the Japanese politician Kawabata Sadaji in 1932. So it's interesting, there's a long history of these Japanese imperialist politicians getting assassinated. So Shinzo Abe, was a truly horrendous figure in Japanese politics, promoting historical revisionism, glorifying Japanese imperialism, whitewashing Japanese atrocities against the Korean people, Chinese people, and other people in East Asia, and even Allied prisoners and such. He's truly a very bad figure, a promoter of xenophobia against the Korean population living in Japan. There's a large Korean population in Japan. So he won't be missed at all in the world. He was a horrendous person. And let's also remember this guy, Shinzo Abe, he once said Assad must go. Well, now we see what has happened to him.